Imagine stepping into the dazzling corridors of a royal palace in the year 1785. Gold leaf glimmers from every surface, mirrors multiply the splendor, and the fragrance of imported roses hangs in the air. To foreign eyes, this place was the beating heart of European civilization. But if you listened closely, past the rustle of silk gowns and the chatter of courtiers, you might hear something else, a sound not meant for dignitaries or chroniclers. Faint cries, a muffled plea, hidden behind embroidered drapery. The kind of sound that once heard could never be forgotten. What took place in those chambers was not the innocent gossip of noble salons. It was ritualized cruelty, paraded as evening entertainment. While powdered dukes and jeweled duchesses sipped imported wines, wagers were whispered over how much pain a child could endure before collapsing. Laughter blended with sobs, turning elegance into something monstrous. And the most shocking part? None of this was fantasy. Contemporary testimonies and confiscated records prove it. The ruling elite of late 18th century France presided over more than 25 million subjects. Yet within the palace walls, humanity was bartered away for spectacle. We often hear about excess, diamond necklaces, masked balls, cakes and pastries, while peasants scavenged for crusts. But behind the glitter of chandeliers lay something far darker, a systematic culture of exploitation. One so grotesque that when the revolutionaries later uncovered its details, even men hardened by executions trembled at what they read. This isn't merely about indulgence or extravagance. It is the hidden chronicle of how aristocratic power turned human suffering into a pastime, of how children became commodities, bodies became currency, and philosophy itself was twisted to justify horrors. At first glance, Versailles in 1780 represented achievement. Diplomats wrote admiringly of its salons lined with crystal and gilded panels, of gardens engineered to stretch further than the eye, of a court where a single wig could cost more than an entire village earned in a year. Visitors saw refinement. They did not see the rot beneath. Over generations, unchecked wealth and inherited privilege warped the nobility. What began as petty boredom among idle elites metastasized into networks of cruelty that spanned Europe. Here, indulgence was not hidden, it was institutional. Depravity was celebrated as sophistication, and cruelty disguised as enlightenment. Among those who epitomized this descent was Armand de Rocheval, a duke whose very name became synonymous with aristocratic vice. By the mid-18th century, his reputation reached far beyond France. Other nobles traveled great distances to observe his inventions. Court diaries describe him as witty, persuasive, and utterly without conscience, a man who embodied the fatal confusion of elegance with brutality. His daily rituals reveal the industrial scale of aristocratic perversion. Each morning, attendants laid out a handwritten selection list. These were not menus of delicacies or wines, but inventories of human lives, children and youths catalogued by age, condition, and what they were trained to endure. Rocheval would make his choice as casually as one choosing a dessert after supper. Weather, mood, or some passing philosophical phrase might guide his decision. Then, his chambers would prepare accordingly. And he was not unique. He was only the tip of a chilling iceberg. Another branch of the nobility maintained what they cynically called an academy, a grand Parisian townhouse where children, some barely 8, were schooled in services demanded by the court. Women who, in public, projected refinement and piety secretly financed supply chains that delivered fresh victims to Versailles with the punctuality of couriers. It would be a mistake to imagine these horrors as spontaneous crimes. They were cultivated, systematized, and defended with rhetoric. For generations, the elite had convinced themselves that ordinary morality was the province of peasants, that their own station and advanced thinking granted them license to transgress. Exploitation was framed not as depravity, but as experiment. The true escalation came in 1747, when a coalition of high nobles founded a private society under the banner of philosophical liberty. What they created was less a salon than a criminal organization. Hidden within a mansion in Paris's Faubourg Saint-Germain, this society was shielded from scrutiny by high walls and higher bribes. Even corrupt officials turned away, unwilling to be tainted by what they suspected lay inside. The society's records, seized decades later, confirmed the scale. Ledgers listed victims by category: gender, appearance, training, procurement agents, scoured not only the French countryside but foreign capitals, transporting human cargo with the same efficiency merchants used for silks and spices. Members included dukes, bishops, wealthy financiers, pillars of society by day, architects of degradation by night. The mansion itself was designed for duality. Upstairs, grand salons hosted intellectual gatherings. Polished floors reflected candlelight as men debated Rousseau and Voltaire. Meanwhile, from discreet side chambers, servants carried in catalogues, bound in leather, describing the entertainment awaiting below. In the basements, soundproof chambers stood ready. Some resembled training rooms, others resembled torture pits. What survived of their devices belongs more in museums of cruelty than in any palace. This society's darkest innovation was not simply indulgence but philosophy. Members documented their experiments with meticulous care, as though writing treatises. They debated not merely what could be done to victims, but what insights these acts revealed about power, obedience, and human fear. Journals written in elegant script describe scenes so deliberate in their brutality that even seasoned revolutionaries, decades later, could barely continue reading them aloud in court. One chilling entry theorized that tormenting children was not cruelty at all, but a form of early education, teaching submission and resilience, while offering nobles the thrill of absolute dominance. These twisted rationalizations cloaked barbarity in the language of enlightenment. But this was only the beginning. Soon, these nobles grew restless with cruelty in its raw form. They sought to elevate it to transform torment into what they dared call living art. They called it innovation, they called it culture, but in reality, it was a nightmare staged with rehearsed precision. The society's new obsession was spectacle, elaborate productions, where suffering was disguised as performance. Members referred to these grotesque events as living tableaux. Unlike the spontaneous depravity of earlier years, these required planning that stretched across months. Victims were transformed into unwilling actors in what nobles considered artistic recreations. The most infamous of these projects was staged in a private estate outside Paris. The manicured gardens, usually a place for polite promenades, were reshaped into an imitation of a painting well known in Europe, a vision of paradise twisted into torment. Children and young adults were painted, costumed, and even physically altered to resemble the figures of the artwork. When the gates opened, nobles strolled through, wine goblets in hand, commenting on the aesthetic beauty while interacting with the human figures who dared not move. Preparations were as brutal as the show itself. Victims were confined for weeks in isolated chambers. Some were starved to achieve particular body shapes, others forced into positions until muscles locked in pain. Those who resisted were broken down methodically, with punishments disguised as training. Artists were hired, not painters or sculptors in the traditional sense, but specialists who modified flesh itself. They were called consultants, yet their craft was indistinguishable from torture. Not all productions were modeled after paintings. Some nobles preferred religious parodies, mocking rituals they outwardly professed to honor. Boys dressed as altar servers, girls as angels. Under candlelight, scenes unfolded that desecrated the very faith that once bound the kingdom. Members, cloaked in clerical robes, carried out ceremonies designed not only to gratify their appetites, but also to humiliate the church. Such blasphemous performances spread quickly across aristocratic Europe. Nobles from distant lands traveled to witness them, sometimes bringing their own offerings as tokens of gratitude. What began as a Parisian indulgence grew into an international market, with requests for custom performances ordered much like one might commission a new opera. Records later uncovered reveal how these events were reviewed in chilling detail. Members wrote critiques as if they were evaluating theatre grading, the artistic quality, the endurance of the performers, even the elegance of the cruelty. The productions were rated, ranked, and discussed as cultural achievements. In their own words, they believed they had elevated exploitation into philosophy. But as these grotesque spectacles spread, their influence began to reach the throne itself. Royalty, already accustomed to indulgence, began treating such entertainments not as private diversions, but as sanctioned exploration. What had once been secretive gatherings now brushed against the machinery of the state. In 1761, a royal decree cloaked in the language of intellectual advancement quietly legitimized certain philosophical pursuits. The wording was vague, but those in the know understood its meaning. It gave the nobility freedom to continue, provided it was veiled under the guise of study. Out of this decree emerged a new bureau, a government office designed not for governance, but for concealment. Officially, it was dedicated to advancing human knowledge. In reality, it coordinated aristocratic appetites. This bureau maintained archives thicker than military records, lists of participants, ledgers of expenses, transportation manifests detailing how victims were moved between estates under guard. Most disturbing of all, dossiers recording every noble who took part both for organization and for leverage. Blackmail was the unspoken foundation of the entire system. Once a name was on those pages, silence was guaranteed. With royal protection, the network expanded into something resembling an industry. Whole estates were converted into facilities, each specializing in a particular discipline. Some trained children in obedience. Others offered religious-themed spectacles. Some even claimed to research the limits of human endurance. No corner of the nobility was untouched. Even minor lords began building their own private chambers, emboldened by the knowledge that law and crown alike now shielded them. The French court became infamous across Europe. Wealthy elites from Russia, Prussia, and England traveled in secret, eager to taste what they had only heard whispered. Exchange programs were arranged. Victims were traded like commodities, techniques shared like recipes, philosophies debated as if cruelty itself were a science. Yet, for all its secrecy, the system left traces. Too many victims vanished, too much money changed hands, and too many peasants began whispering that their children had disappeared after recruiters promised work in noble households. These whispers would grow until they became accusations, and accusations would, in time, ignite fury. For now, though, the network thrived. It operated with the efficiency of government and the cruelty of unchecked privilege. Its participants told themselves they were philosophers, patrons of art, pioneers of knowledge, but every scream silenced behind velvet curtains brought them one step closer to their own downfall. By the early 1770s, the machine of aristocratic indulgence had reached its full momentum. What had once been whispered evenings in hidden salons was now an enterprise spanning provinces. Protected by decrees and maintained by secrecy, the nobility treated their perversions not as vice, but as state business. The Bureau of Philosophical Studies, as it was politely named, became the hub of this shadow empire. Its clerks, trained like any other civil servants, spent their days drafting ledgers and recording files. But instead of harvest yields or military rosters, their documents listed children, categorized by age and use. They logged which estates they were sent to, how long they survived, and when replacements were needed. Transports crisscrossed the countryside, covered wagons, sometimes marked as delivering fabrics or supplies, in truth carried young lives toward fates that would never be recorded in church books. Entire villages whispered about sons and daughters who had gone to serve nobles, only to vanish without a word. The losses became so frequent that even the most desperate families began to sense the truth. Finances told the same story. Expenditures ballooned into millions of livres annually, sums so vast they dwarfed the food budgets of entire provinces. One duke alone spent enough on his private academies to feed thousands of starving peasants. When revolutionaries later seized these ledgers, their jaws clenched in disbelief. The accounts read less like noble indulgence and more like industrial bookkeeping. By this time, the network's operations rivaled any commercial venture in France. Facilities were categorized by function: training houses, performance estates, preparation chambers. Each had its own overseers, staff, and guards. Victims were processed in numbers that shocked even seasoned investigators decades later. Thousands every year. Names erased, identities stripped, replaced only by codes and descriptions in bureaucratic files. But the very efficiency that sustained the system began to betray it. Scale required infrastructure, and infrastructure left traces. Records could be forged, but empty villages could not be hidden. A missing child in one town might be dismissed. 100 missing across a region became undeniable. By the late 1780s, murmurs spread through markets and taverns. Mothers spoke of children promised to work as domestic helpers who never wrote back. Fathers gritted their teeth at recruiters who offered coins for their offspring under the guise of opportunity. Some families, driven by hunger, accepted the bargain, only to realize later that no service household could swallow such numbers. Whispers grew into petitions. Petitions turned into rumors. And in a kingdom where famine already stoked resentment, rumors became fuel for fire. At court, however, the indulgence continued. Nobles congratulated themselves on their sophistication, oblivious to the powder keg outside their gilded gates. They debated philosophy over wine, while peasants clawed for bread. They staged grotesque pageants of living art, while families lit candles for children never returned. The irony was cruel. The aristocracy, so certain of its superiority, could not see that the very system they had built, efficient, documented, sprawling, contained within it the evidence of their own destruction. Each ledger entry, each receipt, each coded journal would one day be pried from their vaults and read aloud before furious crowds. When that day came, their excuses would sound absurd. But for now, in the waning years before the storm, the elite pressed forward with ever grander spectacles. What once shocked them now seemed mundane. To feel thrill again, they escalated, blending cruelty with theatre, art with desecration, philosophy with blood. And while the chandeliers burned bright above polished marble, the shadows beneath France grew restless. The peasants had not yet risen, but they were watching, waiting, counting their dead. The year 1789 cracked France open like a thunderclap. Bread riots shook Paris, banners of liberty filled the air, and whispers of conspiracy turned into roars of revolution. While nobles fled or scrambled to maintain privilege, hidden vaults began to yield their secrets. Among the confiscated estates were trunks of parchment, bound ledgers, and leather journals. At first, Revolutionary Guards assumed they were inventories of jewels or military correspondence. But as prosecutors read, the rooms grew silent. These were not financial accounts of trade or war. They were catalogues of human suffering, written in the polished hands of aristocrats who believed no one would ever see them. Pages detailed victims by number and description. Some included notes on performance quality, others evaluations of endurance under torment. Margins contained signatures, proof that names once untouchable had endorsed every act. For a nation starved and furious, these papers were not merely evidence, they were accelerant. News spread fast. In Paris, crowds gathered to hear fragments read aloud in public squares. Hardened executioners who had seen men torn apart by mobs wept at the passages, describing children prepared for living art. Mothers clawed at the air, screaming the names of their vanished sons and daughters. Every word deepened the conviction that the aristocracy was not just wasteful or indifferent, but monstrous. Trials began almost immediately. Nobles accustomed to bowing courtiers now faced tribunals armed not only with revolutionary zeal, but with their own words. Journals that once passed hand to hand at secret gatherings were read aloud in court, exposing every boast, every justification. The contrast was stark. On one side, nobles claimed refinement and intellect, insisting they had pursued philosophy, art, and exploration. On the other side, peasants and revolutionaries heard only cruelty elevated to science. For the common people, this was not philosophy. It was proof that their rulers had become predators wearing powdered wigs. The punishments were swift. Some aristocrats, realizing the evidence left no defense, took their own lives before facing the guillotine. Others tried to flee abroad, only to be dragged back in chains. A few, unable to endure the shame of exposure, poisoned themselves in prison cells. One prominent duchess escaped to England, hoping exile would shield her. But even across the Channel, rumors followed. When found dead in her chamber, whispers claimed she had chosen laudanum over extradition. Another duke attempted to bribe his way into obscurity, but was betrayed by his own staff, who had seen too much. The revelations did not stop at France's borders. Correspondence discovered in the archives implicated nobles from Russia, Prussia, and beyond. Governments scrambled to deny involvement, but the letters were damning. European elites, once eager participants, now rushed to destroy their own records before revolution crossed frontiers. Back in Paris, the public consumed every detail. Pamphlets reprinted the most shocking passages, feeding outrage. Caricatures depicted nobles in grotesque poses, mocking their so-called philosophy. To a nation long starved and silenced, the truth of aristocratic depravity provided justification for vengeance. The terror that followed was not born solely of hunger or politics. It was also fueled by moral outrage. The people had seen the mask ripped away. Their rulers were not guardians of civilization, They were architects of cruelty. And so, when the blade fell in the squares of Paris, it was not only for taxes and famine, it was for the children lost, the families broken, the humanity traded for entertainment. By the end of 1793, much of the network lay in ruins, estates burned, archives scattered, participants dead or fled. Yet even in destruction, secrecy lingered. Countless documents were destroyed by panicked nobles, erasing names and stories that history would never recover. What survived was enough to condemn, but not enough to tell the full scale. Entire libraries of evidence went up in flames, taken by those desperate to bury their sins. Still, the fragments that endured painted a picture unmistakable in its horror. They revealed a system where cruelty had been institutionalized, defended as culture, and celebrated as intellect. And they revealed the ultimate irony. The very records meant to preserve their philosophy became the chains that dragged them to execution. By the mid-1790s, the palaces that once gleamed with chandeliers stood hollow, marble cracked, gardens overgrown, and silence hung where once laughter mingled with screams. The aristocracy's grand experiment, their attempt to disguise depravity as refinement, had collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. Yet the lesson of their downfall reaches beyond Versailles, beyond Paris, beyond the revolution itself. The documents that survived, fragile and stained, reveal more than just cruelty. They reveal how quickly human vice can transform when it wears the clothing of power. What began as indulgence became routine. Routine became institution. And once the state sanctioned it, institution became machinery efficient, relentless, and vast. This is the true danger of absolute authority. Not only that it corrupts individuals, but that it builds systems to justify the corruption. Systems that look polished, intellectual, even enlightened, while in truth feeding on the powerless. The nobles of late 18th century France were not born monsters. They were ordinary people born into extraordinary privilege. But privilege, without restraint, convinced them that morality was beneath them. They dressed up cruelty with philosophy, cloaked exploitation in the language of art, and convinced themselves that their intelligence placed them above the common laws of humanity. When the revolution came, it did more than punish them for extravagance. It judged them for confusing civilization with barbarity. It tore away the silk curtains and revealed that behind the glitter of Versailles, there had always been a prison of flesh and bone. And yet, history warns us that this pattern repeats. Ruling classes throughout time have cloaked excess in culture, excused brutality with clever words, and convinced themselves their actions served higher purposes. The French archives show us that when unchecked, power does not simply indulge, it organizes, it documents, it industrializes cruelty. That is why these pages matter. That is why some risk their lives to preserve them, even as nobles tried to burn every trace. Because the story is not only about France, it is about us. About what happens whenever authority faces no boundaries, whenever philosophy bends to justify appetite, whenever human beings are reduced to instruments for pleasure or control. The fall of the French aristocracy offers a chilling reminder. Civilizations do not collapse only from famine or war. They collapse when their leaders convince themselves that cruelty is culture, and when ordinary people finally see the truth with their own eyes. So, when we think of Versailles, we must remember not only its mirrors and gardens, but its shadows. Not only the brilliance of its chandeliers, but the cries muffled behind its walls. Because the real legacy of that gilded palace is not refinement or elegance. It is the warning it carved into history that without limits, power will always seek to turn human suffering into entertainment. And if this hidden chapter leaves you wondering what other truths lie behind polished facades, you are not alone. These stories survive because someone dared to preserve them. Someone knew the world would need to remember. So look deeper, question harder, because what hides behind beauty often tells us more than beauty itself.